I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor.
Hey, it's Dr. Jordan Robertson, and if you've been following along with me, you know that I absolutely love female hormonal health, and my goal through the podcast and all of the things I do is to help support women feel their best in their day-to-day lives. I turned 40 in January, and my gift to our community is a full-day workshop where we're going to learn how to bulletproof your 40s. I'm not afraid of turning 40, and part of the reason for that is my knowledge and the tools that I have entering this decade of life that's going to support me to feel my overall healthiest self as I turn 40. I want to share this information with you. And so as a community, we're going to group together, we're going to celebrate, and we're going to learn all the things you need to know to feel as confident as I do about turning 40. This seminar is for any person over the age of 35 who identifies with having some hormonal changes as they're aging, whether you've already cruised through menopause, whether you're white knuckling it through perimenopause in your 40s, or whether you're just curious about the hormone changes to come. This is going to be a full day workshop about learning about your body, your hormones, and how you can take control of the symptoms that you experience. I'm excited for you to join us, and our tickets are on sale now at an early bird price right up until my birthday, which is January 11th. You'll get access to the recordings for 30 days after the main event. And so if you can't make it on the actual day, we promise that that knowledge is going to be something that you can put in your back pocket for later. I hope you join us. Click through in the link in the episode today. This episode is brought to you by Bulletproof Your 40s. Hey, welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm pretty excited about this guest that we have today, Alan Flanagan. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
My pleasure, Jordan. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we've got around to doing this.
So, I have about 10,000 questions for you, Alan. I'm excited for you to share your perspective and your knowledge and your experience with our audience. You sort of embody everything that I want about nutrition on social media, which I know we have a love-hate relationship with social media. Mm-hmm. But I would love if you could kind of introduce yourself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I stumbled across your work and how important it's kind of been to me over the last 3 years. But if you could just take it away and introduce yourself to the audience, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm basically wrapping up my PhD thesis at the University of Surrey, which is in the UK. Prior to that, I did a master's in nutrition science at the same institution. And I did that really out of interest. I was, and even kind of for more background context, I spent a decade practicing law as a barrister in Ireland, in Dublin. And that was my original kind of route plan in life. I majored in history and English. I went to law school. I became a lawyer. I thought, right, this is it. And there were kind of other interest itches that I wanted to scratch. And nutrition was always something that was kind of one of these hobby interests that I had. And I started self-learning. Perhaps because of the law background, I found myself gravitating to looking for evidence. And I guess I became what you might call a PubMed warrior. And I very quickly realized that I kind of didn't know what I didn't know. And, I realized that, look, this is a subject specific knowledge that one would need. And so started looking around to study nutrition, again, purely out of interest. And over the course of my master's, I really found myself drawn to the research. I was always drawn to the science side. I never wanted to be a dietitian. I actually did. I think we talked about this before. I spent 6 weeks actually in the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario and shadowed one of the clinical dietitians there for a few weeks. And it was such a fascinating experience. But it was very clear to me I didn't want to go into dietetic or nutrition practice, and it was the science and the research side that I was drawn to. And I knew I wanted to pursue that further by the end of my master's. And I started then a full-time PhD pretty much 3 years ago to the day almost. And during my PhD, I set up my current education platform, Millennia Nutrition, and also started working with Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition. And so a huge bulk of my life now is kind of, I guess, in the quote science communication side of things. And one of the things that I've pieced together, I guess, more in hindsight is I'm really grateful for the experience of being in law and what it meant for me going into science. And most people would say, oh, they're completely different. How did you go from one to the other? And they're different on a superficial level, but there's a lot of kind of epistemic overlap. And I think a lot of the way that I approach trying to consider science and nutrition research in particular comes from this very epistemic place. And it's not just, well, what does this study show? It's, well, how does this study show what it's purporting to show? And they're always the questions that I'm much more interested in. And that's kind of the level at which I try to communicate through the website and the work I do with Sigma.
Yeah, and it's something that I've come to be so appreciative of. My background is also in critical appraisal, which I talk about loosely on the podcast. I think, that's not something that like my audience is particularly interested in, and like how I went to school to study whether or not studies are accurate. Yet that actually is what makes great clinicians. We just don't maybe spend enough time talking about that as we should. And I don't actually remember how I came across you and your work, but I remember that feeling of being like, are we still on social media talking about apple cider vinegar? Like, are we still talking about how if we give zinc to institutionalized elderly, meaning like if people are living in a home and they have horrific nutrition and we give them zinc, it makes them better. And now we're going to extrapolate that everyone in the world should take zinc. Like, these were my frustrations, right? That I was like seeing this being portrayed. When I started the podcast, it was literally about like, how do we make accessible evidence-based information? And I felt like I was up against this like massive wall that was, just, it was impossible for me to penetrate. No one was interested in talking about the evidence when, we could talk about apple cider vinegar and that's way sexier. And somehow came across like you, and even like there's sort of a group, I would say, or a movement in nutritional science online that's like actually trying so hard to break down those barriers and helping create more knowledgeable consumers so that they're maybe not led down that like sort of misinformation path. But now I'm in your group, your education group, and have been for the last couple of years. And I find the information that you're putting out there so valuable. So thank you.
Thank you.
But nutrition is different. Yes. Nutrition is different than other sciences. And I think that that's been like to its disadvantage for a long time when it comes to research. Like, can you help the audience understand, like, why is that? Like, I mean, I know that's a huge question, but why is the research on nutrition need to be looked at differently than other things?
Yeah, so there's a kind of accident of history to an extent with some of this. And nutrition as a formal science really began to evolve in the kind of late 19th century and early 20th century. And at that point, no one really knew necessarily what vitamins and minerals were, right? So there's these food properties in food, and it was understood that, well, if you give someone one food, or maybe another, and you get different outcomes. And there's a really famous example of that, which was on Royal Navy ships in 1750. And scurvy was rife in sailors. And a doctor basically gave sailors, there was 20, I think, in total, and he divided them into groups of 4, and one got citrus fruit and the other got garlic and the other got this, that, and the other. And the group getting citrus fruit recovered rapidly. Now, of course, we know that was because scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, and citrus fruit's rich in vitamin C. But it took quite a while for us to actually get that understanding of, well, what are these compounds in foods that are required? So nutrition evolved very much focused down the lens of single nutrients, of isolating a single nutrient in a food and saying, this is vitamin B1, thiamine. This is vitamin C. This is vitamin E. Great. And for much of the early part of the 20th century, that was really important for public health, because the conditions facing public health that were rife in the population were things like rickets, vitamin D deficiency, or goiter from iodine deficiency, or pellagra from vitamin B3, niacin deficiency, or in the Far East, beriberi from vitamin B1 deficiency. These were diseases of single nutrient deficiency. And when those nutrients were identified, it was able to then, for example, use mass food fortification of flour with vitamin B3, and you eradicate that disease, or fortify milk with vitamin D, and you eradicate rickets in the population. And, a lot of countries adopted iodized salt. So we have this early kind of focus very much on single nutrients because, and it's really beneficial. These conditions are eradicated at the population level largely. From about the late 60s, 70s onwards, then within medicine, we have the emergence of the biomedical model. And that really began in the UK in the late 50s. There was a trial, the first kind of proper biomedical standard randomized control trial. And it started to become very focused on, methodology, and proper randomization and blinding and all of these kind of methodological approaches to really teasing out, does X cause Y, or does A treatment, is it better than no treatment, or is it better than treatment B? Is surgical intervention A better than surgical intervention B, etc. And the issue, and anyone listening, for example, that has a background in psychology or other elements of the social sciences, other disciplines, is all really health sciences, nutrition included, started to kind of get squeezed into this umbrella. And it was expected that this was the gold standard model to investigate any condition and any kind of relationship. And this wasn't without criticism. The person who's considered the godfather of the biopsychosocial model, George Engel, wrote a series of papers in the late 70s calling for the need for psychology and psychiatric research to develop its own model, because his whole point was that, look, this model is great for investigating drugs or surgeries, but it's not good for investigating conditions of the mind. So it's not that this was not known, shall we say. But nutrition very much then kept its single nutrient focus and was also expected to operate within the biomedical model. So as an example of the friction that this created, let's say you had an observational association that higher levels of vitamin E were beneficial for cardiovascular disease or for neurodegenerative disease. Well, within the biomedical framework and within the single nutrient framework, what would happen is people would go, aha, this is an observational association. So the logical next step is to make a supplement version of this isolated nutrient, give it to people, and compare it to people not getting it. Classic RCT, double blind, blah, blah, blah. And loads of these trials found nothing, whether it was vitamin E, antioxidant supplementation, which actually even increased risk of certain outcomes. And everyone throws the book in the air and says, aha, it's the observational research is wrong. Nutrition science is all bogus and blah, blah, blah. But you look at a drug trial, right? If we're giving people statins, right? I don't have bits of statin floating about in me. You don't have bits of statin floating about in your system. You don't habitually have statin in your cornflakes, right? So it's easy to give people something they don't have, because the absence of a drug is not the reason someone gets a disease. You don't develop cardiovascular disease. Oops, I forgot to eat my statins for 40 years. Whereas nutrients, it's the exact opposite, really. It's the absence of a nutrient or the excess intake of a nutrient or food that is associated with long-term risk. They're really different questions. And we can easily, in the statin example for cardiovascular disease, take people with that disease. They already have the disease. And the drug's designed to treat that disease. And we can give it to one group of people and we can give the other group cornstarch, nothing. And suddenly we've got this massive comparison. But with nutrition, we're generally interested in whether it can prevent disease. We take people that might have a disease, but in the vitamin E example, just to keep it relevant to people, if you look at those studies, everyone in the trial that was in the supplement group already had enough vitamin E. They measured their vitamin E at baseline. They already had enough vitamin E. They were eating it in the diet every day. So it wasn't like it was just suddenly being introduced. What these trials were really testing was whether more of enough is better than more than enough, because the placebo group already have enough. And so it's taken a long time for people within nutrition to kind of bang on a drum a bit and say, look, like the outcome of an RCT here is not necessarily a reflection of the failure, so to speak, of the nutrient. Actually, there's this methodological issue that comes with trying to do nutrition research as if we were studying drugs, right? And that's this epistemic friction that arises where actually nutrients exist on a bell curve from, like we were talking about deficiency states earlier. Well, we can have marginal insufficiency, and then we kind of enter a range of adequacy. And within that range of adequacy, more isn't necessarily better. And then, of course, we can get to marginal excess and then what they would call toxicity. But that's not really something we tend to be concerned about unless it's like really high dose, supplementation. But what we would think about more from excess is like levels of an intake that would significantly increase risk of a disease. So this is completely different to comparing a drug versus nothing, versus a zero exposure. And it often means that people have at least adequate amounts of most nutrients because they're going into a trial and they don't have a deficiency. And it means that, for the most part, we can't just come up with, in biomedical research, if an observational finding is contradicted by the findings of a controlled trial, the default position is the control trial is right, the observational findings were wrong. That's applied to nutrition. That's untenable for nutrition. It's highly plausible that the RCT is the one that's wrong. Now, that's not to say the observational research is right necessarily, but the idea that by default the RCT is correct and the observational research is wrong is untenable for nutrition, because the RCT could have basically tested the wrong hypothesis, asked the wrong research question, and got a finding that is not reflective of the activity of a given nutrient. So really what we're more concerned in is, what's the effect of changing levels, particularly where people might have low or high levels. So yeah, there's a lot of, and this brings us to today, I guess, where in the last 5 years, there's really been a lot of researchers in the field of nutrition kind of publishing commentaries and editorials calling for nutrition. Look, nutrition needs to do its own thing. It needs its own standards of assessing evidence, because often biomedical appraisal tools like the grade system are applied to nutrition. And then the default outcome is, this is low certainty evidence. But it's like, yes, because you don't always have double blinding in a trial where your participants have to consume olive oil. They know they're consuming olive oil. You've asked them to consume it. So these are completely different methodological approaches, and it makes a lot of nutrition science very challenging. It certainly means that a lot of the findings in nutrition need way more due diligence to pick apart. And unfortunately, that's not really done. And the field is often just strawmanned and assumed to be really unreliable and inconsistent.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge trickle down effect from all of that, right? Because what you're saying is that like the traditional way that we consider to be like the best quality evidence, like that's like square peg round hole when it comes to nutrition, because there's so many ways that you need to read the research, like with that lens of, things like baseline status, right? And so that's why we'll see trials on fish oil in Japan show nothing because they eat a heck of a lot of fish already, right? Or, my example I used earlier, anytime we give anyone who's institutionalized anything, they do better because their diet is shit, right? And so we need to look at it differently. And yet, like at the clinician level, that's not always getting disseminated in the same way because we teach clinicians in that biomedical model. But I do think there's some like ripple effect into the then, the information that people have access to from a nutrition perspective, because we end up with either we throw out all the evidence on nutrition and just say, well, there's no evidence for anything, right? Which there's certainly some camps that will say nutrition doesn't matter. But then we also end up with like these other pieces of information that are getting, they're getting showcased as if they're evidence-based comments or pieces of information when they're not. Like, what do you think that trickle down effect is there that we, that we haven't done a great job of acknowledging this, like maybe up until the last 5 years?
I think it potentially plays out a couple of ways. I think one is that, it's difficult for clinicians, again, whether they're in dietetics or private nutrition practice or whatever there, or another discipline where they also use nutrition in an adjuvant context. Clinicians are busy with their practice. They're often also busy building their business, which is also their practice. And and again, that was one of the major motivations with me for the website was, I would have people who are clinician and practitioner friends being like, God, I'd love to be like you and stay on top of all the research. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, and so what happens is, they're busy doing all of this stuff. And it means that they don't really have the same amount of time to kind of keep all of those appraisal skills sharp and to even just stay on top of the kind of the breadth of research coming out or updates, etc. And so, I think with a lot of that, what we end up having is kind of almost like your undergrad level or your master's level knowledge kind of just staying at this plateau then. So the actual level of the dialogue doesn't kind of update someone's mental model to include some of, a lot of this kind of recent, critique that we're talking about. And then I think what happens is you still have a huge amount of bias in the overall healthcare system, shall we say, or in the overall healthcare environment. There's still an enormous bias towards the medical profession above other healthcare disciplines. And to medical doctors in particular. And I've gone to conferences in the UK, for example, where it was nominally supposed to be a nutrition conference, right? And it was just a bunch of random, like medical doctors who had an interest in nutrition, who were the ones giving a presentation. They've never published a paper in the field. They've never done anything in nutrition. They're not in the field. And yet there wasn't a single nutrition scientist or researcher presenting. And it was mind-blowing to me. And I couldn't figure it out. And I was just like, this is that kind of almost bias within healthcare coming out, that if someone can listen to someone who's qualified in nutrition versus someone with an MD, they'll listen to the MD. And as a result, we have the perpetuation of a lot of either just outdated or just flat out wrong, incorrect nutrition evidence or interpretations of that evidence. So, I've had friends that have given out to me for, quote, doctor bashing. But, at the end of the day, like, I would never, ever, ever presume to walk into a surgery and just be like, scalpel, and go to work. It's like, and when you...
I saw a podcast, or I listened to a podcast, I'm ready. Put me in, coach.
Yeah, like when you frame it to medics in that way, they suddenly kind of get, oh yeah. Like the idea that I would go on my social media and start talking about, like a discipline that I have an interest in neuroscience. I think it's a really cool field. Like imagine I just started talking about neuroscience. People will be like, you're a nutrition guy, shut up. But, prominent neuro people come on talking nonsense about nutrition. Everyone's like, oh my God, you hear this podcast? I'm like, how is this inconsistency being applied? So I think nutrition is unfortunately a victim of the fact that everybody eats, right? So not everyone is a physicist. If you say I'm a physicist, everyone will go, wow, you have domain specific expertise in something I can't even compute. Right? If you say, I have domain specific expertise in nutrition, someone's like, I had breakfast. I ate this morning, right? So they almost think because of their oats, they're like your peer, your intellectual peer, and suddenly you're having to debate with your aunt at Christmas table who watched a doc and they're not backing down. So nutrition is ubiquitous. Everyone has to eat, and as a result, then kind of everyone's an expert in their own way. And then when you have so many branches of healthcare that have a vested interest in nutrition, they're all, and nutrition's sexy, right? Giving a drug to someone is like, it's not sexy. And like, I joke about this all the time because I call the cardiovascular drugs that are available now, I always refer to them as sexy drugs. And people are always just like, why do you call them that? And I'm like, because they're excellent, because diet's going to do a fairly minimal job at getting your cholesterol levels to a level where you won't die of heart disease. But these drugs will get you there within a month. Like, do the drugs, and that's not to discount the role of diet and good diet. It's just to say that nutrition, everyone loves to kind of think of, food as healing, as medicine, and all these kind of other compounds. So I think there's various strands that create this continued level of nutrition dialogue, which is the lowest common denominator of the conversation, unfortunately. And other healthcare professionals and their quote interest in nutrition. I'm like, look, again, I don't care if you have an interest in it, that's fine. But if you have an interest, at least ask experts, and don't assume to know it yourself, which we get a lot of people doing with nutrition. And then the kind of populist element, I guess, of nutrition is the second major issue. And then I think the fact that like we just have a lot of people that would have been trained or studied nutrition very much through that biomedical lens, and that's their foundation work in this area, and maybe their mental models haven't necessarily updated, and that's not to blame them, of course. And then we just have the wider kind of field of documentaries, misinformation, and otherwise. So yeah, it's a mess.
They're quite compelling, some of those documentaries.
Actually,
I haven't watched a single one of the nutrition documentaries. I just can't at this point.
No, I haven't. No, and I won't.
No, I refuse. Yeah. But I think that's kind of to one of the things that we were chatting about off mic, and that I want to get out of this conversation is just how vulnerable, specifically women, I think are, but I think everyone is vulnerable to, getting sucked into some of these conversations around nutrition that can lead to harm. So one of the challenges that I have with this nutrition conversation is that we often will cite, well, it can't hurt as a rationale for why we would do something, right? So if patient says to me, like, I'm gluten-free, I'm like, you don't have to be. And they're like, well, it can't hurt, can it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right? Or I'm going to have apple cider vinegar every morning in my water. And then it's like, well, it's not really doing anything. And they're like, yeah, but can it hurt?
Yeah.
And it's almost like we've downgraded the importance of nutrition to this point where we don't care if it works or not. We're, for some reason, going to subscribe to these behaviors for some reason. Yeah. I don't know if it's identity or if it's belonging or I don't know what. And so we've created this huge problem where we present the information in a way that well, even if it doesn't do anything, do it anyways, because it's cool. We've given a huge voice. Like you said, Gwyneth Paltrow has oatmeal, or maybe she doesn't. I don't know what her special diet is.
I can't imagine she does. There's something wrong with it. There's definitely something wrong with oats.
Probably. Yeah. So whatever. She has her ice cubes, and that has now made her and lots of other, physicians actually feel really compelled to share their own nutritional opinions and create lots of following around that. It's like a vortex of a problem because the science part, we've had this conflict going on in the background. So we can't firmly put our foot down quite yet. And so it's let this breed this opportunity where we have the carnivore diet. How is that even a thing?
Yeah. I think there's with all diets, there's the continued tendency to extremes, I think on one level is almost like it's not unique to nutrition. Like we're seeing the tendency to extremes across a range of issues in society. So I think there's just always going to be people that are just drawn to those extremes. I think that the popularity of these extremes, and again, although the most kind of prominent extreme of the last year probably was the carnivore diet, which falls under the kind of umbrella of low carb. It's not necessarily just that, and there's a diametrically opposed extreme in the plant-based movement as well. And there's extremes in both of these camps. And of course, they're both shouting at each other. And, irrespective of the fact that what's on their plates is probably diametrically opposed to one another. But we have this tendency to extremes in nutrition, and it's largely led by people who are first and foremost within a belief system. I think that's one of the parts of nutrition that I find most frustrating. I can't think of another aspect. I can't think of another discipline within science or health sciences specifically where the subject of inquiry doubles as a belief system, right? Like no one in theology is trying to prove the existence of God. Like they're just discussing, like various existential issues, but they're not out there trying. And within the hard science, like physics, you come up with a theory, you can test that theory, right? It's maths, it either holds or it doesn't. With nutrition, we have the unique and unfortunate co-occurrence of the fact that this is a subject that's important because we have to eat for life. It's a subject of inquiry for the scientific field of nutrition, but it's a belief system. It's an ingrained belief system. It's an identity. It forms a very important part of an individual's self-construct. And there is research on this, which is very, in fact, a paper published last year was entitled, a quote from one of the participants was, "An important part of who I am." And so people, and I think with humans, we know that human beings are drawn to being in a group or a tribe. And once you are there are certain behaviors and ways of speaking and thinking that you're expected to perform in order to demonstrate that you're part of that tribe. So, for example, within the low carb movement, I can absolutely predict a number of their beliefs. I can absolutely predict the narrative that people in that movement have about, how we got dietary guidelines about animal fat and the research behind that and cardiovascular disease and blah, blah, blah. And it's so predictable because it forms a set of beliefs, right? I can do the same with the plant-based movement, right? The kind of the extreme end of that spectrum, right? There's a bunch of beliefs within that movement that are equally just faith-based rather than evidence-based. And so I think that's what underpins this very kind of identitarian aspect to diet. And it's a reason then why we have no ability to resolve in any sort of meaningful dialogue any of the evidence, right? Because you just get someone who, if you go at a certain point of evidence, you're not really then critiquing evidence in a kind of general, objective scientific way. You're by questioning certain evidence or refuting a certain claim with evidence, you're essentially attacking, or they're perceiving it as an attack on their self and on their identity. And so that there's no ability to get through to anyone in that context. And there's certainly no ability to have any sort of reasoned discourse. With the Gwyneth Paltrows of this world, I think that's slightly different. I don't think what's going on there necessarily is the kind of identitarianism that we get in the extreme low carb camp or the extreme plant-based camp. I think what's going on there is something a little different. And it's something I've had conversations with a number of other people that I know in healthcare. And what I think maybe is going on there, if we really pay attention to that, is there's a very targeted focus, and we can see this in the wellness space, and with multi-level marketing schemes. We can see this in what we might call like the woo kind of areas of health. Is that there's a very particular focus on women for marketing of these kind of products, and the rhetoric of that kind of targeting of women is particularly interesting to pay attention to, because it's a marriage of this real quote boss babe, feminists, get 'em girl, like slay girl slay kind of mindset, with this really pseudo spiritual woo rhetoric, this like inner divine feminine goddess, like, and so this, and it's really potent. And like, look, it's being targeted at largely middle class, people with means, to be able to, splurge on whatever, products or courses or programs or whatever are there. But I find the rhetoric of that kind of goop culture, so to speak, very interesting to pay attention to, because it really does target this whole. But it's very neoliberal ultimately. It's targeting this very individualistic kind of materialistic idea, cloaked in this veil of kind of empowerment and higher level enlightenment, blah blah blah. And that's not to hammer entirely on this from a gendered standpoint, because we see a similar thing with Joe Rogan culture. It's like he's the male equivalent of goop culture, and that's kind of also interesting to pay attention to. And it's this kind of weird mix of almost kind of conspiracy theory thinking with this kind of just asking questions trope, coupled with a very odd portrayal of masculinity, which seems ultimately to be fairly regressive, in terms of where we'd like to get men to go. But yeah, so I think we've possibly kind of two levels to this. I think on either extreme of the nutrition spectrum, we have the kind of like, I literally just eat steak and eggs, and that's very identitarian based. And then on the other end, we have the plant-based, which is like, oh, I don't eat avocados, or I don't drink olive oil, but I eat olives because oil's processed, like just whatever absurdities exist there. And that's very identitarian. And then there's a culture then aspect within all of this that's propagating misinformation. And there is a very gendered element to the rhetoric within that culture if we pay attention to that. And like I said, on the one hand, there's this very kind of like, bro-tastic, like watch MMA. It's all predictable, and kind of engage in like the whole just asking questions to embrace conspiratorial nonsense thinking. And then on the other hand, you've got the kind of marriage of this kind of very much feminist empowerment plus spiritual enlightenment. But if you buy this product, you will attain outer beauty, and all this kind of stuff. So it's a mess.
It's a mess. And you know what? And I think about it often, right? Because I like to think that my work with women is falling way more in that evidence. Well, I know it's falling way more in that like evidence-based, kind of like Western medicine meets, I'll spend a little bit more time with you to have this conversation. And I think when I think about it, it's the way that we've dealt with women's health from a conventional medicine standpoint has led to this potential for women to look for answers elsewhere, right? Because when we think about most women's health concerns, and even there's some research on this, like if we spend more than 5 minutes with them, we are, a million times more likely to diagnose their ovarian insufficiency and prevent them from seeing 7 specialists if we take the visit length from 5 minutes to 10 minutes. Right? We know that there's a bit of a setup there, especially for women's health, where we don't spend enough time. They don't feel heard. we haven't researched it enough. We don't have enough subspecialty to talk about this. If you're not having a baby, you don't get a gynecologist. And it leaves women in this space where they feel misunderstood, right? And they feel unheard. They feel like there isn't a spot for them in medicine. And then you get Gwyneth and her, what are the eggs? The vaginal, like
eggs,
right? The vaginal
the jade egg.
You get her, the jade egg. That's what I was looking
Everything
for.
will be fine.
Obviously, I don't have one because I don't. But you get her, and that
yes.
culture showing up at this exact moment that she feels there's something wrong with her health, but nobody cares. Right? Or that she needs an alternative answer because mainstream is wrong. Mainstream doesn't care. And I think when I'm trying to guide people around that, like the moment that your diet or whatever it is says, your doctor doesn't know, there's a special secret that nobody's told you before, you know, we've always thought it was Y, but turns out it's X. Like those should be red flags, I think, for people to start to realize, like, actually, we kind of do know what we're talking about when it comes to nutrition. And as soon as the way that this program or whatever it is you're consuming is positioning itself as this brand new idea, like it's wrong, probably.
Yeah, it's a red flag. Yeah,
It's a red
I
flag.
know you're right, and a major part of this, and this is possibly why there's certainly within the kind of woo space, it is difficult not to notice that it is, you know, distinctly dominated by women for the most part, and consumers are primarily women, and we have to step back and ask why. And like you said, you know, we have this massive issue with representation in medical research for women, and they're often either wholly underrepresented or there's simply not really any evidence at all. We have a spate of female-specific conditions which have a dearth of research, whether, you know, we've talked about this before, endometriosis, uterine fibroids, any of the, even polycystic ovarian syndrome research has probably exploded in the last decade. But there are a number of female-specific health conditions for which there are very little answers. And very little satisfactory understanding of the research. So, of course, if an individual is experiencing symptoms or a condition, or in fact, they've got a diagnosis, but they've got a shrug of the shoulders as to what they're going to do, that individual is going to be very vulnerable to the way in which quacks in the wellness space tend to communicate, which is one, they communicate with certainty. Right? It's like, I know what I'm talking about. It's this, it's that, it's the other. Two, we're talking about people who have been disempowered by the conventional system, which is why I think that language of empowerment, you know, very much kind of like feminist empowerment language that is used by quacks in the wellness space is such an effective marketing ploy. So you've got certainty, you've got a promise of empowerment, you've got the promise of like achieving a better self, a higher self, all of this kind of stuff. Like, this isn't just going to be a health transformation. This is going to be a whole, you know, inside and out kind of overhaul type thing. And I don't, you know, and I always want to be really, whenever we start talking about this, I always want to be really clear that, like, you know, we're not criticizing the person that goes and buys some bullshit supplement or a program, because I can absolutely understand how they got to that place. The people we're critical of are the ones manipulating and targeting specifically these vulnerable people in order to make a profit. And the problem, because it's all under the health umbrella, is if you ever criticize those people, the people actually profiting off people's vulnerability and lack of, you know, and kind of almost desperation for answers, is they'll just put the hands up and say, but I'm just trying to help. I'm just helping people though. And it's like, I've had enough of that answer, because it's not, you're not trying to help people. You're just trying to make money. And B, if you were really trying to help people, then you wouldn't sell them bullshit. So it's just such a hollow lie.
Yeah, there's so many red flags in there, but there are things that I think are, when I think about like the take homes of our conversation, right? It's like starting to be able to pick up on that stuff quickly. It's almost the same as like reading a paper, right? Like the first time someone sits down and reads a paper, they're like they're overwhelmed by the information, but really there just takes some skills to be able to like see all of those bits of information that are being given to you, to be able to read it in a way that's like, is this usable information for me or not? And actually that kind of literacy is all I want for people that are navigating the online space or just their healthcare in general. That if your doctor says there's nothing you can do with your diet, that's actually a red flag too, because we probably have some evidence about something. They just don't know or don't have the time or interest. If you're finding content that is giving you this absolute certainty of an extremist opinion that is brand new, special, never been done before, I want you to see that as a red flag.
Yeah.
Right? If you're feeling like your desperation and like if you're actually trying to buy hope, I think that that's a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah. And to be really honest, I guess, with someone's self-assessment, so to speak, as to like, okay, well, why am I turning to this information? And to kind of like do a bit of a self-audit on, okay, is it because that I've had a doctor who, kind of waved me out of the room? Could I get, is there someone else you can go to? Are there, second opinions you can get? Or, it's like, yeah, like you said, that kind of almost stepwise critical approach to where you're at, and to kind of what your purpose is. And I think that's important for clinicians as well, is, this idea that, I mean, obviously we're kind of talking about some rampant quackery, but it can be common for, we mentioned this before we started recording, it can be common for clinicians to kind of default into this paradigm of like, where's the harm? Oh, just do this. Where's the harm? And it's like, no, we need to be more thorough with deciding whether someone is going to do something or not, because harm with nutrition may not necessarily be entirely obvious, but if you're giving someone an intervention, and diet is an intervention, you're giving someone an intervention which they don't need, then what's the trade-off? Are you getting them to restrict a bunch of foods for no evidence-based reason? Well, there's a trade-off here. And even at that, a lot of what can come with diet or dieting or this food, not that food, is not necessarily physiological harm, but potentially mental harm, as far as developing, like disordered behaviors or dichotomous thinking or any of this stuff. And a lot of that is stuff that people are kind of blind to. I think practitioners can often be a bit blind to that. So there's kind of two sides to this. We want individual consumers to be much more kind of thorough and critical with paying attention to the way that wellness, nutrition, wanky marketing tends to target them, and to have a healthy skepticism for that targeting and for what's being offered and for what's being promised. As desperate as they may be for answers, it's like still maintain that level of like if a bunch of drugs haven't, that have been developed specifically to target a condition, if someone's telling you that actually diet can do better than those drugs, they're likely full of shit, right? Because unless you're overtly deficient in a nutrient, then you're talking about marginal impacts on health. Because once you have enough of a nutrient, more is not better, because you have a saturation point of your body's utility for that nutrient, right? So the functions in the body associated with that nutrient are maxed out, basically. So you take more of that, you either pee or poo or sweat it out or whatever. And the idea that diet, like I said, unless you're wildly insufficient in intake, which is very rare for people in the developed world because of food fortification, unless it's a very restrictive diet for whatever reason. The promise that diet change is going to fix whatever it is that, like drugs and surgery can't. If that promise is being made, be highly, highly skeptical. It's probably wrong. And that's not to say that the available drugs or surgery for a given condition are the answer either. There are plenty, there are conditions where, it's possibly marginal gains from that, or there aren't any good. I think of Alzheimer's, for example. Like there hasn't been a single drug approved for Alzheimer's treatment since 2003. 99.9% failure rate of every pharmaceutical ever developed to combat neurodegenerative, dementia and Alzheimer's specifically. So food, potentially diet, can be useful for someone there over the course of the long term, focusing on certain dietary characteristics that we think might be beneficial for the brain. But you could this is the difference between nutrition and drugs. You could do all of those dietary characteristics we associate with reduced dementia and Alzheimer's risk and still get dementia or Alzheimer's because it was genetics, because it was other environmental exposures. There's a limit to what diet can do. And that's not knocking the importance of good nutrition over the course of the lifespan. It's just a reality of how nutrients behave in the body. So I'd love for people to come away with that kind of healthy skepticism. Like, yeah, diet's really important. And you can take people, if they have really poor dietary habits or certain habits that have them consuming kind of excess levels of nutrients that we might associate with an increased risk of a certain outcome. And you can make really meaningful changes to their diet that will, that will either reduce or offset that risk of disease or improve their health in a really meaningful way for them. But food is not a drug, and nutrients aren't drugs, and food isn't medicine. So, be kind of just have that level of healthy skepticism. And I guess that message is directed at both clinicians and, consumers in the lay public.
Yes. And I love that message. It's funny because I lecture often on endometriosis, and I think like to clinicians, and I feel like every time I get up, they're waiting for me to talk about the nutrition, right? Or the special diet or the whatever. Yeah. And to talk about it like in that lens, right? Of being like, actually, yeah, we don't really know. Like there's not a lot of evidence here. We have some like evidence that like potentially we see an increased risk if people have various dietary behaviors or dietary patterns, but we can't then take those foods out of a patient who already has pre-existing disease and make it any better.
Yeah.
Right? Which is another common mistake that we make in the nutrition world.
Yeah.
And that's what I want both the clinicians and the listener, layperson to come away with, is that we just need to be way more critical of the whole thing than rather than saying like, it can't hurt, so I might as well, because like you said, there is harm somewhere, whether it's your wallet or your time, right? Like if you're spending 20 hours a week meal prepping, what are you not doing?
What are you not doing? Yeah.
Are you not going to bed? Are you not going for a walk or meditating or like maybe some of the other health behaviors that I would really love for you to do, right? What will happen if you didn't do that? Like, is our overall health actually better if we can some of these patterns of nutrition that are costing you both time and money? I think for the vast majority of people, like the answer is they would be healthier if they had if their nutrition was taking up less space in their life, they would be healthier.
Yeah. 100%. 100%.
Right? And this is coming from people who love nutrition.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Like we're not knocking nutrition. It's just, it's the time that people spend barking up the wrong tree. Like it's enormous. And if it is a health condition that they're trying to deal with and manage, like the potential, again, you're talking about these kind of unseen harms. It's like you could just be wasting your time when that time could also be spent continuing in a more thorough, evidence-based approach kind of figuring something out, right? Rather than just like, I'm drinking this like turmeric because, it's like, stop.
I knew you were going to say turmeric.
Yeah.
Alan, I'm so grateful for what you offer. You're so generous with the information that you put out in your podcast, online. I love the work that you do through your website. How can our listeners get more of what you share? Where can they find you?
So on social media, I only operate through Instagram. So that's at @thenutritional_advocate. I don't have Twitter for sanity purposes. So that's where they'll find me on socials. And then the website is alineanutrition.com. And that is much more focused at healthcare professionals than the lay public. And I'm always very clear to say that. So, people with a health sciences background, I would say most members are nutrition professionals, followed by medical professionals. And then we've got various kind of people who are like physios, or some people in the kind of the psychology area that are interested in this stuff as well. And so that is where the majority of my kind of science communication is going through. So there's the weekly research review, the deep dive into a particular study, which is also focused kind of on expanding on like methodology as well as it relates to nutrition science. And then there's 2 research lectures, which are in video form a month. And then there's these periodic long form articles. So you'll find me there. And then you'll also find me at sigmanutrition.com. So with Danny Lennon, I record a couple of monthly podcasts. We now have a new member of that team as well, Dr. Neve Aspel. So we're doing these kind of like, breakdowns of particular questions in nutrition. So you'll find that really on any podcast provider. And there's also some like written, what we call Sigma statements, which are kind of like long form summaries of particular kind of areas in nutrition. So you will also find me there.
And we will put all of those links in the show notes so that you can grab it straight from where you're listening from. Sigma is actually my favorite podcast. It's my most listened to podcast over the last 2 years. So thank you so much, Alan, for hanging out with us.
My pleasure, Jordan. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.